I think the EUI is to be thanked for its refugee policy because both James Dennison and I are bored of talking about Brexit or listening to others talk about Brexit as if it was a uniquely English event. And while I fear, as my wife is English, some of the causes may be uniquely English, it's not Paul Gillespie or Bridget's problem. But my talk starts with alternative sources of legitimacy, which I started on a year ago, and Barnier and Theresa May and the British Parliament are now demonstrating it. But it is legal, rational, is absolute. We must keep within the treaty. We can interpret it. This is our political interest, but we must stick to the rules even if we don't like the outcome. The supremacy of the acquis we don't unpick, whereas Cameron May's rules are all about unpicking. Collective elites. It is not we the people, which is the American Constitution. The Irish adds three more, the Most Holy Trinity. And in the case of Belgium, they have a king, and Germany. It's quite interesting reading the preambles of national constitutions, especially when the people is less obvious. But it's a collective elite, and this is the Schuman, the Gasper, and Eve was reminding me that they spoke German when drafting the Schuman plan. But it is very un-English. National democratic institutions, the interesting thing is that British MPs have given up on parliamentary democracy, that direct democracy is now a superior value because the majority of the House of Commons in a free secret ballot would vote to remain, and they won't. They are trying to fudge it. But this is a very, very striking phenomenon, I find. Now, so that's the general point. Referendums, and I have a project at the Schuman Center, are about a single policy. And we've already had other papers talking about the shift to issue policy, and James, immigration, culture. The issue that's the issue of policy is either two-dimensional or shifted to immigration. It is a way of getting rid of untrusted representatives, or representatives you just cut out the middle person. You make the choice yourself. And while John Stuart Mill could question the capacity of uneducated people to vote intelligently, and Remainers can, and Barroso has explicitly, it still isn't very popular when there's a national ballot going on to tell the voters they're not up to it. Though it's very striking, the Dutch have just repealed their advisory referendum. The clause in the Austrian is meant to protect the elites against, as Wolfgang was telling me, against an initiative. So there's an attempt to nip it in the bud rather than have to face it. Another thing is, of course, that referendums reject errant Leipar and the EU norm of consensus because they offer a binary choice, and somebody loses, especially if there's a real issue. the absolute value for the Brexiters, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never will be slaves. I mean, this is a song that every school child learns. However, they also learn the story of King Canute. And Canute tried to hold back the waves. And this, of course, is what the Remainers call chaos. But the whole rhetoric of the Remainers is not to defend representative parliamentary democracy. It is about calculations of the benefits of the single market. And it's very striking. My third book was called Influencing Voters, a study of campaign rationality, and it was about how irrational business people are when they campaign. This was in the 60s on nationalization. Well, the City of London was leading the campaign. They lost their one MP in 1949. They have 10,000 voters. And if you want to have a target to attack London bankers. So they were not terribly helpful. And they were doing this in part because the parties were split, which now, the interesting feature of the referendum since the Constitution is that all of them, except the Hungarian and the Spanish 2005, emphasize division, not consensus. Now, this is known as politics. And the EU, in one sense, is anti-political. It's about elite consensus, which is in the interest of member states. Now, member states are all right when you've got a monarchy, and the king's advisor can declare war, as Edward Grey sucked the British into World War I without the will of the people, negotiating in bad French, or in the Wilhelmine Reich. But there's no longer a body politic. There's a split of lesser or greater salience. So my definition of politics, it's about the articulation of conflict, which is binary in a referendum. But secondly, it's about the reconciliation. And the problem with a clear majority for something that's non-negotiable in principle is how you interpret the principle. And Theresa May got there for two reasons. First, Brexit means Brexit. Nobody knew what she meant. They knew that someone who voted Remain had abandoned the Remain cause, and they would have her in their grasp because she couldn't be trusted. They'd make her deliver. Secondly, she was clueless about what the EU is about and has since continuously demonstrating it. Where are we? Now, I have a three-stage model of referendums in the European context. If you have a referendum on the alternative vote system in the UK, or should Swedes drive on the left or the right, or something about abortion or gay marriage, this is within the power of the national government. But in a world of interdependencies, referendums, the Eurozone, immigration, etc., the issues on referendums that interest me and interest the UK are about interdependencies transnational. So your output of your national vote is an input. The second stage then is the deliberation. It's interesting because a lot of organizations in the City of London are not deliberating firmly enough about what they'll do a year from next summer. Options on real estate in Dublin and office space. They're just trying to avoid deliberation. The EU can't because of Article 50. This is a very legal, rational process. The United Kingdom Foreign Office can't deliberate on what to do in a global world. It's very, very striking, which, just to resurrect Eric Crow in 1913, they had a balance of power, they had an imperial policy, because first of all, they've got a fool who has no policy, and secondly, the government split, and other things are more important, like how does the Prime Minister deal with this week's crisis, which is last week's cost. The EU has set the terms. That's what Article 50 does. You have the right to withdraw. We meet you at a table, and here are our terms. And the way in which the terms have been agreed, which their chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, didn't make them up, but no sane person would take the job without agreed terms and reading them. Secondly, I pay tribute to the Spaniards and the Irish for adding in Gibraltar, as well as Ireland. The Poles don't need to add the rights of EU citizens in Britain because they're there. It's obvious. So there is some national interest in the collective terms, but we don't break the acquis. We don't have more referendums on exit. We have other things to worry about. To try and tell someone in Southwest 1 that next year's elections, the new parliament, the new commission is important. People just don't care in London that the 7-year budget is important. They don't care because it's a kind of autistic policy in a negotiating situation. What the UK government lacks is a parliamentary majority, an internal agreement, a single-party government that can't agree a Brexit policy. The deliverable alternatives are to go out next March, in whatever it is, 55 weeks, or to accept an off-the-shelf option, like Norway, which is impossible in the UK. No one's people who advocate it do it in op-ed pieces. They don't expect to have the votes in the House of Commons. But you have competitive unicorn. Now, metaphysically, and this is where Catherine de Vries's thing was interesting, you can't say that there will never be a unicorn in the future. Religions last very nicely on future promises. Thorstein Veblen said, no one's ever come back to complain. The trouble is that Brexit's a feedback model, but we're not talking about the British party system at the next general election, because the feedback will be there beforehand. So you have the UK abandons the acquis and wants to keep Britain, solve Theresa May's politics. All I would tell anyone in Brussels is you can't confidently expect the Prime Minister to deliver a deal she agrees to. It's uncertain, because the cabinet will split. Parliament votes for a second referendum and Remain wins. Next December, what happens the following March? It's in the rule book, Britain is out. And de-withdrawal or restart the negotiations when you've got a EP election, a new commission, to-dum. The British government withdraws, and there's an acceptance of a withdrawal or withdrawal. Well, Immediate uncertainties. Well, I realize there's one certainty. The government's unicorn compromises will come unstuck. The uncertainty is when and how, or how many times. Theresa May is every initiative is a new patch, because the old one came unstuck. I think it's single digits when we get to the end. Secondly, it's whether 15% of Tory MPs will trigger a no confidence vote in the Prime Minister, which requires an election where the candidates are unknown. 15%, there's probably 30%, 30 of them who've already signed it. I mean, it's very, and it wouldn't take much. And she just was dumb enough to get rid of her experienced whip and make him a minister. So it's exclusion of knowledge. And the last uncertainty, and it's a less than half, but whether there could be a temporary coalition of people to put an amendment to the government proposal that the Prime Minister brings in, and the amendment is half real and half unicorn. Conclusion, the clock that is ticking is not a clock, it's a fuse. And we know when the fuse will stop ticking, and we know what happens when it stops. Boom. Time's up.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Richard.